This is the story of Lapidoth, the quiet, faithful husband of Deborah, the prophetess and judge of Israel. Though his name is only briefly mentioned in Scripture, his steady presence supported one of the most remarkable women in biblical history. Because supportive spouses behind strong leaders are part of God's design. Once upon a time, in the rugged hill country of Ephraim, there stood a simple home nestled among the olive trees. The man who lived there was not famous or loud. His hands were skilled from years of shaping wood, and his heart was anchored by quiet strength. His name was Lapidoth. He was married to Deborah. Before anyone came to know her as a prophetess or a judge, Lapidoth knew her as the woman who saw the world with spiritual eyes. She had a stillness about her that held deep insight, and even early in their marriage, he noticed she often paused as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. Sometimes she wrote things down, not from memory, but from something deeper, something divine. Lapidoth never tried to silence the stirring inside her. He didn't question the moments she would stop mid-sentence to pray, or why she would stand outside under the palm tree, unmoving for hours. He recognized early on that God had placed a call on her life, and instead of competing with it, he made room for it to grow. As the seasons passed, word began to spread. People came from distant towns not to see Lapidoth, but Deborah. They came with questions, arguments, confessions, and left with clarity, peace, or conviction. Deborah's wisdom was unlike anything the people had heard before. She never sought power, but God gave it to her. She became a judge of Israel. Each morning, Lapidoth watched as she prepared to sit beneath the palm tree where the people gathered. He didn't stand beside her or draw attention to himself. He sharpened her tools, folded her shawls, packed dried figs for the long day. He quietly made sure she had what she needed to fulfill her calling. He knew her strength came from God, but he also knew that strength needed a place to rest when the work was done, and that place was their home, his arms, his silence, his prayers. On the morning God told Deborah it was time to deliver Israel from its enemies, she stood at the window still and focused. Lapidoth did not ask what she had seen or heard. He didn't need to. He could feel it in the air. Something sacred had shifted. And so he began to prepare. The scarf, the sandals, the small pouch of honeyed almonds. He packed everything without being asked. Lapidoth understood his role, not as the leader, not as the voice of Israel, but as the quiet foundation beneath the one God had chosen to speak. And though the world would remember her name, God also remembered his. Because sometimes the greatest strength is found in the quiet support of someone who believes in what God is doing, even if their own name is never lifted high. The morning light spilled softly through the olive branches as Lapidoth swept the small courtyard outside their home. The air was cool and quiet, broken only by the hum of bees near the fig trees and the gentle creak of wood beneath his broom. Life had a rhythm here, simple, unhurried. But something had shifted. Deborah had been restless all week. She hadn't said much about it, not in words, but Lapidoth knew her well enough to notice the subtle signs. The way she paused mid-task to stare at the horizon, the way her hand hovered over her writing tools but didn't move, and how at night she lay awake longer than usual, eyes fixed on the rafters above. She had received a word. Lapidoth could feel it. That morning she rose early and stood at the window watching the hills beyond the trees. She said nothing, just folded her hands in front of her and waited. Lapidoth placed a small cup of warm goat's milk near her and didn't ask any questions. If it was from the Lord, she would speak when it was time. A few hours later, he was sanding the leg of a stool when he heard the sound of horses in the distance, not the slow, uneven clop of travelers, but the hard, purposeful rhythm of riders. He stood, wiping his hands on his tunic, just as the first figure broke through the trees. Deborah had already stepped outside. She didn't look surprised. The men who arrived were dusty from travel, their faces lined with concern. At the front was Barak, son of Abinoam, a strong man with sharp eyes that revealed more fear than he meant to show. Lapidoth stepped back into the shadow of the doorway, watching quietly. Their voices were low, but Lapidoth heard enough to understand. Israel's enemies had grown bold again. Sisera, the commander of the Canaanite army, had begun to threaten the tribes with his iron chariots and ruthless soldiers. The people were afraid. They needed deliverance. And Barak was being called to lead them. But not without Deborah. Lapidoth saw the hesitation in Barak's stance. He agreed to go, but only if Deborah would come with him. Lapidoth felt a chill pass through him, not from fear, but from recognition. This was what Deborah had been preparing for. God wasn't sending her to counsel from the side, He was sending her into the heart of the storm. Deborah's answer was firm. She would go. And with that, the men rode off to gather the troops. Deborah remained still for a long time after they had gone, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. Lapidoth approached slowly and stood beside her. She didn't speak at first. Her breathing was steady, her face unreadable, but her hands trembled just slightly. He gently reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'll prepare your bag," he said quietly. That was all. There were no arguments, no attempts to talk her out of it. He didn't remind her of the danger. He didn't ask how long she would be gone. He simply returned to the house and began folding her things with care, her cloak, her sandals, a pouch of dried fruit, a small flask of oil. He placed her favorite scarf last, folding it slowly, the way she liked. That night, they ate in silence. Deborah prayed quietly after the meal, then laid her head against his shoulder as they sat beside the fire. The room glowed with the soft light of a single lamp. He did not ask what tomorrow would bring, he already knew. And though his heart was heavy with the weight of what she was about to face, he found peace in knowing she wasn't walking away from him. She was walking in obedience to God. And he would be right here when she returned. Deborah left before the sun rose. Lapidoth stood at the doorway, arms folded across his chest, watching her figure fade into the pale light. Her steps were calm, each one steady as the ground beneath them, and she never looked back. He didn't expect her to. That wasn't how she moved through life. Once God spoke, Deborah walked forward, without flinching, without delay. The quiet that followed her departure didn't feel empty. It felt purposeful, like the house itself was holding its breath. Lapidoth stepped back inside, closed the door, and sat at the small table by the window. A folded piece of linen lay where she had written a final note the night before. It wasn't a farewell, just a single line of encouragement, written in her careful hand. "The Lord goes before us." He read it twice, then tucked it into a small wooden box where he kept other things she had written, notes, prayers, fragments of songs she had begun and never finished. For most of the day, he stayed busy. The steady rhythm of work helped calm the silence. He collected water from the well, trimmed the fig trees that had grown too wild, and swept the dust from the edges of the courtyard. His hands remembered what to do, even while his mind drifted, always back to her. He imagined her riding through the valley with Barak and the other men, the hills echoing with the sound of hooves. He imagined her calm among warriors, her voice giving direction, not with the authority of a commander, but with the certainty of someone who knew she was walking in step with heaven. By midday, the breeze shifted. Lapidoth looked up from the olive press, his brow furrowed. The wind had turned strange, cooler, heavier, like the breath before a storm. The leaves whispered warnings in a language only the trees understood. Clouds gathered faster than nature would allow, low and churning above the hills where Deborah had gone. He walked to the ridge and stood beneath the wide fig tree, the tallest in their grove. From here, he could see the northern sky, dark, pressing, alive with the weight of something more than rain. He stood there, unmoving, for a long time. Lapidoth had learned long ago not to measure battles by the noise they made. Some of God's greatest victories were born in silence, while others came with thunder. But this storm, this one felt different, like God himself had stepped onto the battlefield. Thunder cracked like splitting wood, deep and long, and a sudden wind rushed through the grove, toppling a small clay jar near the doorway behind him. He didn't flinch. Instead, he whispered, "She's in it now." He didn't mean the weather. He meant the moment. The moment God had told her was coming. That evening, he prepared her seat at the table as if she might walk through the door at any moment. He placed her carved spoon to the right of the bowl, added 2 figs to her portion, she liked them soft and sweet after the evening heat, and laid her scarf across the back of her chair. She would not return tonight. He knew that. But the preparation helped him remember. Faith doesn't sit idle. It sets the table, even while the storm still rages. When night fell, he lit 2 lamps, one for himself, one for her. He placed hers in the windowsill so its glow could stretch into the dark, like a beacon for when she returned. Then he sat, not in worry, not in fear, in peace. He stared into the flame, thinking of all the unseen things that were happening beyond the hills, swords drawn, voices lifted, enemies scattered, and in the middle of it all, the woman he loved, bold, obedient, burning with the Spirit of the Lord. The world might not remember what Lapidoth was doing that night, but heaven did. And his quiet faith was part of the battle too. By morning the storm had passed. The sky was scrubbed clean, clear and deep with blue, and the trees stood still, dripping with last night's rain. The ground was soft beneath Lapidoth's sandals as he stepped into the courtyard. Small puddles reflected the sky like mirrors. Somewhere in the olive grove, a bird began to sing. But Lapidoth wasn't fooled by the stillness. He had seen storms before, many in his lifetime, but never like this. The way the wind had turned, the sudden rise of thunder, the heavy silence before the rain, this wasn't nature. It was a message. It was God moving. And if the storm had passed, then something had happened, something holy. He worked slowly through his morning chores, his mind always returning to the hills in the distance. That's where Deborah had gone. That's where Sisera had marched with his chariots. That's where heaven had thundered. He bent over the garden bed, pulling weeds from between the rows of young herbs. His fingers moved through the damp earth as his thoughts moved through what might be unfolding miles away. He didn't need details. He trusted the one who had sent her. A neighbor passed by with his mule heading toward the road to the village. Lapidoth offered a polite nod but didn't stop to talk. The man didn't ask questions, though his eyes lingered on Lapidoth's face a little longer than usual. Everyone knew who Deborah was, and they all knew she had gone. As the day stretched on, Lapidoth returned to his carving bench. The lampstand was finished, but he had begun something new, a smaller piece, delicate, slow work, a box for Deborah's scrolls. He smoothed the lid, shaped the corners, and began to etch a pattern around the sides, simple vines and leaves like the ones that curled along their courtyard wall. His hands moved carefully, but his ears remained tuned to the world beyond. Every shift in the wind, every bird that flew low across the sky, he noticed it. And then, as the sun dipped low in the sky, he heard it. Distant hooves. Not many, just one or two. He stood, heart quickening, and moved to the edge of the grove. For a moment, nothing. Just light between trees, then figures. A rider. A cloak he recognized. It wasn't Deborah, not yet, but someone had come from her direction. A young man on a dusty horse, his tunic soaked in dried mud. He looked tired, but not afraid. The rider slowed as he passed Lapidoth's home and gave a small wave. "The battle is over," he called, voice hoarse. "God has delivered us." Lapidoth didn't respond at first. He simply stood still, absorbing the words. Over. Delivered. He let out a slow breath, not in relief, in reverence. He looked down at the small scroll box still in his hands. A fitting gift, he thought. There would be songs now, words Deborah would want to remember, to write, to keep. He had started the box before the news arrived, before he knew, but somehow he had known. He whispered under his breath, "Thank you." Then he turned back inside, lit the lamp in the window, and waited. Deborah would come. And when she did, she wouldn't return as only a judge or a prophetess. She would return as a witness of God's power. A leader of victory, a singer of truth. And Lapidoth would be here, quiet, ready, faithful, as he had always been. It was just past dawn when Lapidoth heard the sound of sandals on gravel, the slow, steady kind that told him she was near. He was already outside, trimming the vines along the stone wall. The shears froze in his hand as he looked up. There, coming down the ridge path through the olive trees, was Deborah. Her cloak was damp from the morning dew. Her steps were deliberate. Her eyes, even from a distance, looked deeper somehow, as if they had seen both fire and freedom. Behind her trailed a soft silence, like the land itself was holding still to honor her return. Lapidoth didn't run to her. He didn't speak. He simply placed the shears on the bench, wiped his hands on his tunic, and walked to meet her at the edge of the grove. They stood facing each other in the golden morning light. She gave the faintest nod, and he returned it. "You're home," he said quietly. "Yes," she answered. "God did what he said he would do. No need for explanations. No need for details, yet. That would come later." For now, Lapidoth reached gently for her pack and lifted it from her shoulder. It was heavier than it looked, not with supplies, but with the weight of what she had just witnessed. He held it with the same care he gave her presence. Inside the house, the fire was already lit. The table was set. He had kept the seat by the window ready all week, along with her folded scarf and the polished bowl she liked best. Deborah sat down slowly, not from exhaustion, but from reflection. Lapidoth poured her a cup of cool water, then sat beside her in silence. Outside, the trees swayed with a morning breeze that hadn't stirred in days. After a long pause, she began to speak. Not in haste, not with drama, just truth. She told him about Barak, how he obeyed, though fear lingered in his eyes, about the tribes who came and those who didn't, about the heavens opening, the storm crashing down, and the river Kishon rising wild. She described how Sisera's iron chariots had been swallowed by the mud, how warriors surged forward with sudden courage, how the enemy was scattered like dust in the wind. She told him about Jael, how it was a woman, not a soldier, who struck the final blow. And all throughout her story, Lapidoth didn't interrupt. He listened fully, as if each word was a seed that needed soil. When she was done, she rested her hands on the table and looked toward the window. Outside, the olive branches swayed gently, catching the sunlight. "I'll need to write it down," she said softly. "All of it. The story. The song." "I started a box," he said, standing and walking to the shelf. "For your scrolls." He set it before her, and she ran her fingers over the carvings, vines, leaves, olive branches. "You always know," she whispered. Lapidoth didn't answer. He just smiled, quiet, steady, present. And in that peaceful home, between the silence of a faithful man and the song of a woman God had used to shake kingdoms, something holy settled into the air. It wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of remembrance, and Lapidoth would help her keep it lit. The day after Deborah returned, the village began to stir with new energy. News traveled faster than any horse. From the shepherd boy to the elders at the gate, everyone now knew Sisera's army had been destroyed. Israel was free. And at the center of the victory stood a woman who had not carried a sword, but who had carried God's word with power. Lapidoth watched from the shade of the courtyard as people began to trickle down the road toward their home. Not with fear, not with burdens, but with offerings. Baskets of figs, jars of honey, bolts of cloth. They came to say, "Thank you." Some came to tell their side of the story, how they had heard the storm crack open the skies, how they saw chariots swept away by water, how their own families had been spared because someone listened to Deborah's instructions. Deborah sat beneath the palm tree again, not to judge this time, but to receive. Lapidoth stood quietly nearby, helping visitors find space, offering them water, making sure the area stayed orderly. He didn't stand close. He never needed to. His presence was enough. A group of women brought a bundle of fresh wheat, braided and decorated with wildflowers. One of them, older and wrinkled, held Deborah's hands and said through tears, "You gave us back our sons. You gave us back our land." Deborah shook her head gently. "The Lord delivered us. I only told you what he said." Later that evening, when the visitors had gone and the sun had dipped behind the hills, Deborah and Lapidoth sat on the bench near the lampstand. The sky turned lavender, and the first stars blinked overhead. Lapidoth handed her a small parchment scroll. "A messenger from Barak. He brought it this morning." She unrolled it slowly and read the few lines aloud. Barak's words were simple, grateful, respectful, and full of awe. He asked Deborah to write a song for the tribes, a song that would not fade when memories grew faint. Deborah nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "It should be sung," she said, "not just written. It should be remembered." Lapidoth stood and walked to the shelf where the box sat, the one he had carved in her absence. He opened it and placed the first rolled parchment inside. "Then let's begin." She smiled and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I never thought my voice would be used this way," she whispered. Lapidoth looked at her gently. "I did." They didn't need ceremony or crowns. Their home was a sanctuary, their table a place of prophecy, their quiet lives a holy rhythm of obedience. And as the oil in the lamp flickered with golden light, Deborah dipped her pen into ink and began the first line of what would become a song sung for generations. And Lapidoth, as always, kept the flame beside her burning steady. The house was filled with the scent of cedar wood and ink. For days, Deborah wrote. Not like a poet searching for beauty, but like a prophet recording history, line by line, breath by breath. Her scrolls piled up beside her, each one holding the weight of heaven's justice, the rhythm of Israel's deliverance, and the echo of war turned into worship. Lapidoth made sure the ink stayed fresh. He cut parchment when she ran out. He stirred the cooking pots between paragraphs and tightened the hinges on the gate when it creaked too loud and broke her focus. He didn't hover. He didn't comment on every line. He simply created the silence she needed to sing clearly. She wrote mostly in the mornings, when the sky was bright and the air was still. Then in the evenings, they would sit side by side outside watching the trees move like slow waves, letting the day settle around them. One night, she read aloud to him what she had written. When the princes in Israel take the lead, when the people willingly offer themselves, praise the Lord. Her voice was soft, but full of something deeper than pride. She wasn't writing about her own courage. She was writing about God's. She looked over at Lapidoth after reading the line. I didn't do this alone, she said. He didn't answer right away. He leaned back against the olive tree and let her words hang in the air like the last light of day. You were never alone, he finally said. In the days that followed, people continued to stop by. Some brought gifts. Some brought questions, but a few came just to sit and listen. Word had spread that Deborah was writing a song of deliverance, and those who had seen the storm, who had tasted fear and then watched it disappear, wanted to hear the words while the memory still burned bright. Deborah didn't mind them listening. She often wrote aloud, speaking lines as she formed them, and though she never once named herself in the center of the story, everyone who heard the words understood she had been chosen. Not for her might, not for her title, but for her heart. And Lapidoth, he was the first one who had seen it. Long before the battles, long before the palm tree, long before tribes had gathered or commanders had trembled. He had seen it when she was still young and still unsure, when her visions woke her at night and her hands shook as she wrote them down. One afternoon, Lapidoth went to the nearby village market, just for a few things: linen thread, a jar of honey, a fresh bundle of reeds for parchment. When he returned, a young boy was sitting by the house wall, legs crossed, a curious expression on his face. She really writes it all down? The boy asked as Lapidoth passed. Lapidoth gave a small nod. Every word. The boy looked down at his own scuffed feet. My father said women aren't meant to lead armies, said the victory was strange. Lapidoth paused for a long time. Then he knelt beside the boy and spoke with calm kindness. Strange things happen when people don't listen to God, but when they do, it's not strange at all, it's holy. The boy blinked up at him, unsure of what to say, but the words stayed with him. Lapidoth could see it in his eyes. That night, when Deborah finished another scroll and gently placed it in the carved box, she leaned back with a long sigh. Lapidoth handed her a warm cloth for her fingers, now stained with ink and effort. They won't forget, he said. They mustn't, she whispered. God delivered us with wind and rain and the hands of women. The world needs to know. And Lapidoth, faithful as ever, sat beside her as the oil lamp flickered, steady and warm. He didn't need his name written into the scrolls, because his faithfulness was written into every line of her legacy. The scroll box was nearly full. Lapidoth ran his fingers over the carved olive branches on its lid, now smooth and worn from frequent use. Each scroll inside carried a piece of their story, Not just the battle and the thunder and the fall of Sisera, but the quiet obedience that led to victory. God's voice, Israel's response, Deborah's song. But now, the writing had slowed. Not because Deborah had run out of words, but because something deeper was settling in. A different kind of work had begun, one that couldn't be measured by ink or parchment. People weren't just coming to hear the song anymore. They were coming to ask, what now? What does peace look like after war? How do you rebuild after fear has ruled for so long? And it wasn't just warriors and elders. It was mothers with children, widows of men lost in the fight, young girls who had never spoken boldly until Deborah had stood on the battlefield and sung. Deborah listened to them all. Lapidoth saw the way her eyes stayed soft even when her shoulders were tired. He watched her cradle the grief of others with the same strength she had carried into the storm. Her calling hadn't ended with victory, it had only shifted, and so had his. While Deborah gave her time to others, Lapidoth became the keeper of the quiet. He tended the garden so she wouldn't have to. He patched the roof before the summer rains came. He welcomed visitors and gently turned away those who came just to be seen. He ensured there was always warm bread on the table, fresh oil in the lamp, and peace in the home. One evening, Deborah returned later than usual. Her face was tired, and her voice hoarse from hours of speaking with a grieving family from a northern village. Lapidoth didn't ask questions. He simply handed her a mug of honeyed milk, placed a fresh shawl over her shoulders, and sat with her by the fire. After a long pause, she spoke. They still think the victory was about the battlefield. Lapidoth looked at her gently. They don't realize the real fight began the moment we won. She wasn't talking about weapons. She meant the fight to remain faithful, the fight to keep the people's hearts turned toward the Lord in peace, just as they had in desperation. He nodded slowly, then said, "That's why you're still here." Deborah leaned her head against the back of the chair and exhaled. Some days I feel like I'm pouring out everything I have. Lapidoth reached down and stirred the fire with a quiet hand. Then I'll make sure your cup is always full again. She didn't answer, but she smiled. It was in moments like this that Lapidoth understood the mystery of what God had done. Others had seen a prophetess, a warrior, a judge. He had seen a vessel, and vessels, even the strongest ones, need refilling. The next morning, Lapidoth woke early and walked alone into the olive grove. He brought with him only a small clay jar and his prayers. He stopped beneath their oldest tree, the one that shaded their home long before Deborah's first vision. There he sat, pressed his hand against the bark, and prayed for her. Not for more strength, but for rest, for joy, for the kind of peace that lasts beyond battle songs. And though no voice answered, the wind stirred gently through the leaves, and a single olive dropped into his lap. A quiet reminder. Even after the storm, fruit still grows. And Lapidoth would be there, tending the roots while Deborah reached for the heavens. The season shifted. The late summer heat softened into early autumn winds, and the olive trees began to release their fruit in quiet rhythms. Lapidoth rose each morning with the same steadiness as the sun, checking the trees, pressing oil, gathering figs, and watching the leaves begin to turn. Change was in the air, but not the kind that stirred worry. It was the kind that whispered, God is still working, even in the quiet. Deborah's days became slower too, though not less full. The crowds thinned, but the questions grew deeper. People no longer came to hear about the storm. They came to ask how to live rightly now that the storm had passed. They wanted to know how to forgive those who hadn't fought, how to trust again, how to walk in obedience when no enemy was chasing them. Lapidoth saw it in her shoulders. The spiritual weight she carried hadn't lifted. It had only changed shape. One afternoon, as Lapidoth finished pressing a small batch of olives, he found Deborah sitting beneath the tree. Not the palm of Deborah where she had judged, but a smaller fig tree near their home. She had a scroll in her lap, but she wasn't writing. Her gaze was far off. He approached slowly and sat beside her on the grass. She didn't speak right away. "I've been thinking," she said at last, "about what happens when a leader's voice gets quieter." Lapidoth tilted his head. "You mean when they stop leading?" "No," she said. "When they've said all they were meant to say. When the most important words have already been spoken, and now it's time to listen again." Lapidoth nodded slowly. "That takes a different kind of strength." She looked at him and smiled softly. "You've always had that kind." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need filling. A few olives dropped nearby, thudding gently into the soft grass. A sparrow darted through the branches overhead. "I think I'm nearing the end of the song," Deborah said. "Not the end of speaking, just the part that needs to be written. The rest must be lived." Lapidoth reached into his satchel and pulled out the last scroll tube he had carved, simple, smooth, and capped with a carved olive leaf. He handed it to her without a word. She held it in her lap and traced the edge of the leaf with her thumb. "You always know," she whispered again. Later that evening, while she sat by the fire finishing the last verses, Lapidoth stirred lentil stew and sang softly to himself, an old melody his mother had taught him as a child. Deborah looked up from the scroll and listened. "I haven't heard that song in years," she said. "You were writing yours," he replied. "I kept mine quiet." He ladled stew into her bowl and placed it beside her, then set a small folded cloth over her shoulders. Outside, the wind rustled gently through the trees, and the lamp glowed with steady warmth. She finished the scroll just before nightfall, and though no trumpet sounded, and no crowd gathered to witness its final line, Lapidoth knew. This was the closing of something sacred. He placed the last scroll gently into the box, sealed the lid, and sat back down beside her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Because the house was full of peace, and the heavens were full of songs, and both had been shaped, line by line, by a faithful woman and the quiet man who stood beside her every step of the way. The first heavy rains of the season arrived in the night, drumming steadily against the roof, softening the earth and soaking the roots. Lapidoth sat beside the fire, sharpening a new carving blade, listening to the sound of water and time. He had always liked the rain. It didn't demand anything. It just came faithfully, washing away the dust, preparing the ground for what would come next. Across the room, Deborah was sleeping deeply for the first time in weeks. Her scrolls were safely tucked away, the song complete. The final lines had been written without fanfare, but Lapidoth knew. Some of the loudest victories end in the softest moments. He stood quietly and added another log to the fire, watching the embers leap and flicker. His eyes wandered to the scroll box on the shelf. It was full now, filled with the battle, the storm, the names, the song. The lid closed gently over a season that had changed everything, and now the house was still. But Lapidoth didn't believe stillness meant the end. He believed it meant transition. The next morning, Deborah rose with a calmness in her eyes he hadn't seen in years. She moved through the house slowly, not because she was tired, but because there was no rush. The work that had once burned in her bones had settled into her spirit. Over breakfast, she ran her fingers over the edge of her bowl and said, "What happens when your life quiets down?" But you haven't. Lapidoth set down his spoon and considered her question carefully. "You keep listening," he said, "even when the voice isn't as loud." She smiled. "That sounds like something God would say. I've lived with a prophetess long enough to borrow a few lines." That afternoon, a small group of young women came to the house. They were from nearby villages, some familiar, others new. They had heard the song. Some had memorized it. Others wanted to hear it in Deborah's own voice. But more than that, they wanted to ask questions, real questions, the kind that don't always have clean answers. How do you know when God is speaking? What if people don't believe you? Is it possible to lead without becoming hard? Deborah welcomed them in, sat among them, not above, and began to speak gently. She didn't preach. She shared. She gave them pieces of her journey without trying to become the center of theirs. Lapidoth watched from a distance, quietly setting out water jars, preparing extra bread, and tossing fresh herbs into the stew pot. He saw it clearly. This was the new season. No longer the voice of war or judgment, Deborah had become a voice of wisdom. And Lapidoth's role hadn't changed. He was still making space for her calling, still protecting her peace, still preparing the ground so others could find their footing. That night, after the women had left and the house was once again quiet, Deborah leaned her head on his shoulder. "I never thought I'd live to see peace, feel this real," she said. Lapidoth wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. "That's because you've never lived through peace before. That wasn't waiting for the next fight." She was silent for a while. Then she said, "This is the first time I feel settled, like I'm not bracing for something." Lapidoth stared into the fire, then whispered, "Maybe the victory wasn't just in the battle. Maybe the real victory is getting to live in the freedom afterward." The flame crackled, and the room glowed warm. In the stillness of that rainy season, Deborah didn't lead armies, she led hearts. And Lapidoth, with every quiet gesture and every faithful breath, kept building the shelter that made her leadership last, not just for a moment, but for a generation. Because even when the song ends, the light of obedience keeps burning. Autumn deepened, and the olive trees turned silver in the wind. Lapidoth moved through the grove with a steady pace, collecting fallen fruit in woven baskets. His hands, rough from years of shaping wood and working the land, knew exactly how to cradle each olive without crushing it. He worked without hurry, humming softly, the same tune he always returned to in quiet seasons. The earth smelled of rain and roots. The world, for once, was not bracing for war, but growing again. Back at the house, Deborah was in the courtyard, surrounded by young girls from the surrounding villages. They were helping her prepare oil from the harvest. Some were awkward with their hands, others clumsy with the press, but Deborah's voice was patient as she guided them. Lapidoth paused at the edge of the trees, watching her from a distance. She had traded a commander's voice for a teacher's tone. And yet, he thought, she was still doing battle, this time against ignorance and fear. She taught these girls about the God who speaks not just in thunder, but in stillness. She showed them how to press oil, but more than that, how to carry purpose. Deborah wasn't preparing them for war. She was preparing them to walk wisely in peace. Lapidoth quietly entered the courtyard, set the basket down, and nodded toward the press. "Full batch," he said. One of the girls turned to him, eyes wide with curiosity. Did you help her during the battle? She asked. Lapidoth looked at Deborah, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I stayed home, he said plainly. But yes, I helped. The girl seemed confused. But you didn't fight? Lapidoth gave a soft smile. Not all battles are fought with swords. And the other girls returned to their work, but the question stayed with him long after the sun began to dip. That evening, Deborah sat on the step near the door, wrapping bundles of dried herbs. Lapidoth joined her, setting down 2 mugs of warm fig tea. He handed her one, then asked, Do you ever think about how strange it all was? She didn't need clarification. All the time, she said. Sometimes I wonder why God chose me. Why not someone louder, someone more obvious? Lapidoth sipped his tea, then said, Maybe because you listened. She looked at him, her brow softening. And why do you think God chose you to be my husband? He smiled. Probably because I don't mind letting someone else take the lead. She laughed gently and leaned her head against his shoulder. The stars emerged above them like scattered seeds of promise. And as they sat in the fading light, Lapidoth thought about the years behind them, before the scrolls, before the palm tree, before the battle. He had seen the story form long before the world did. He saw her calling in the way she noticed things others missed. He saw God's hand in her restlessness, in her quiet strength, in the way her words settled like rain on dry soil. And now, he saw the fruit of it all, not in fame or glory, but in peace. The kind of peace that needed no parade. Just oil for the lamp and someone faithful enough to keep it burning. In a world that still echoed with the memory of chariots and thunder, Lapidoth remained content with his post. Not behind, not beneath, just beside. Where faithfulness lives, where legacy begins. Winter came quietly. The winds no longer carried dust or news of war, only the clean scent of rain and pine, the sound of rustling leaves, and the occasional clatter of olive jars being sealed for storage. The air was cold in the mornings, and Lapidoth had to wake earlier to stoke the fire before the chill reached Deborah's side of the bed. They had lived through storms, through prophecy, through battle and song, and now they were living through something far less dramatic, peace that stayed. Most people don't talk about what happens after the great moments, after the scrolls are sealed, after the praises are sung, after people stop bringing baskets to the door and asking for stories. But Lapidoth and Deborah knew. Peace requires as much attention as war. It must be tended, guarded, and passed on. The two of them spent more time walking together now, down the hill toward the river, through the olive groves, past the old fig trees that had outlasted kings. They spoke less, but their silence was full. Deborah no longer carried the urgency of visions, and Lapidoth no longer waited for the sound of hooves in the distance. One cold afternoon, as they returned from gathering wood, Deborah stopped near the tree she had once judged beneath. The tree still stood tall, the same tree where crowds had once gathered, its bark now rougher, its branches heavier. Deborah stood quietly, resting her hand on the trunk. "This place used to feel like a battlefield," she said. Lapidoth looked at the ground around them. The grass had grown back where feet once trampled, new roots tangled where dust had flown. He said, "Now it feels like a garden." She nodded slowly. "Because you kept it from becoming something else." He didn't reply, just picked up a stray branch from the ground and tossed it into their bundle. He had never sought credit. He never would. But hearing it from her was enough. Back at home, Lapidoth returned to his carving bench. A new piece of wood lay waiting, thick, dark-grained cedar. He hadn't yet decided what to make from it. A box, perhaps, or something more? He stared at it for a while, then began sketching out the rough outline of a small stool. Simple. Strong. Something a young girl could sit on while learning how to listen to God. Deborah sat near the fire, sewing a new lining into her old winter cloak. A few of the village girls had begun visiting again, this time not to hear stories, but to be mentored. To ask questions about hearing God, leading in faith, and remaining faithful when no one's watching. "They don't want a judge," she had said earlier that week. "They want an example." Lapidoth had nodded. "Then let's give them both." That evening, Deborah finished her sewing and placed the cloak beside the door. She turned to him as he worked. "You know," she said, "when I first married you, I thought I was the one being steady." He looked up, hands paused mid-carve. "But I see it now. God gave me a mountain to speak from, but he gave me you so I wouldn't blow away in the wind." Lapidoth chuckled softly. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is," she said, smiling. Outside, the rain began again, light and rhythmic, tapping against the shutters. Inside, the fire crackled, and the house glowed warm. They didn't need a fresh word from heaven. They were living in the blessing of obedience. And as the evening deepened and Lapidoth shaped the wood into something new, he thanked God not for greatness, but for faithfulness that held through every season. Because some of God's strongest leaders rise in public, but his wisest ones remain in the quiet. The sky was low with cloud cover, soft and gray, like wool pulled across the heavens. Lapidoth stood outside beneath the olive trees, examining the branches with careful eyes. It was pruning season, a quiet task, slow and steady. The kind of work that didn't show results right away but made all the difference months down the road. He held the blade in his hand, not rushing, not guessing. He knew which branches needed to go, not because they were useless, but because they were no longer leading toward growth. Back inside the house, Deborah was preparing for something new too, though she hadn't said it out loud yet. Lapidoth had noticed the change. She sat longer with her scrolls, not writing new words, but rereading the old ones. She ran her fingers over the lines as if searching for what still needed to be said, or perhaps what was already complete. That evening, as the lanterns flickered and the fire sent warm shadows dancing across the walls, Deborah sat beside him, scroll in hand. "I think I'm almost done," she said softly. "With what?" he asked. "With all of it. Not my faith, not my voice. But the season, the leading, the speaking over tribes, the carrying of burdens that don't belong to me anymore." Lapidoth set down his carving knife. She continued, "I'll always hear from God, but I think I've said what I was meant to say, and now it's time to let others rise." He looked at her carefully, not surprised, not afraid, just listening. "You're not disappearing," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm just becoming smaller again, so others can grow." She looked at him with a mixture of peace and melancholy. Isn't it strange? We spend so long trying to be faithful in our calling, and then one day God asks us to be faithful in stepping back. Lapidoth gave a small smile. Faith isn't loud. It just stays, even when it stops leading. The next day, she didn't go to the palm tree. She stayed home and took time to teach one of the younger girls how to blend oils. She let her read from the scrolls. She answered questions patiently. When others asked why she hadn't come to judge that morning, she simply said, "I'm still listening." Lapidoth watched as this quiet transition unfolded, not with ceremony or announcement, but like the passing of one season to the next. No one questions when summer becomes fall. You just feel it in the air. That night, Deborah walked with him through the grove. The air was cool, the trees trimmed and sleeping. The stars overhead blinked through shifting clouds. "Do you ever wish you had been given more?" she asked suddenly. Lapidoth raised an eyebrow. "More what?" "More voice, more attention, a larger place in the story." He shook his head. "I was given enough. I was given you. And I was given the strength to stay." She took his hand then, the way she had when they were young and uncertain. And they walked back home under a sky that didn't need to say a word to feel full. Because in a world that chased importance, Lapidoth had chosen something better: faithfulness. And in that faithfulness, both he and Deborah had found not just purpose, but peace. The final frost of winter melted slowly from the rooftops, dripping in steady rhythm from the clay tiles and olive leaves. Morning light crept into the corners of the home like a quiet visitor, gentle and golden. Lapidoth stirred the fire, adding a fresh log with practiced ease. The warmth crept back into the room gradually, chasing out the chill of night. Deborah was awake already. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, her eyes fixed on the horizon through the window. She had stopped writing weeks ago. The scroll box remained closed now, resting in its place like a sealed altar. Not forgotten, but complete. Outside, the village stirred with the soft life of peace. Children ran barefoot across the fields. Mothers kneaded dough without fear. Old men sat in clusters, talking of weather instead of war. Israel was living in the aftermath of obedience, and the land had begun to heal. And so had Deborah. She no longer felt the weight of needing to speak every time someone asked a question. She no longer strained for visions in the middle of the night. God had not gone silent. He had simply said enough, for now. Lapidoth carried the water jars to the courtyard and filled them quietly. Each movement of his hands was a kind of prayer. He didn't need to talk about his devotion. He lived it. Later that day, a traveler from the north passed through their village and asked to sit at the well with Lapidoth. The man, young and full of questions, had heard about Deborah's leadership, how she had led Israel without sword or armor, how she had spoken storms into existence with the word of the Lord. "Is it true?" the young man asked, eyes wide, "that she heard God speak out loud?" Lapidoth tilted his head slightly, then answered, "She heard him clearer than most people hear thunder." The man waited. "And what about you? What did you do while she led?" Lapidoth smiled, quiet and sure. "I made sure the light in our home never went out." That evening, Deborah and Lapidoth sat side by side beneath the fig tree near their home, the one where she first heard the call to judge, long before the battles, before Barak, before Sisera's chariots had been swallowed by mud. The sky above them was streaked with orange and lavender, and a soft breeze played through the branches. "I thought legacy would feel louder," she said. Lapidoth looked up at the sky. "Maybe loud isn't what lasts." She leaned her head gently against his shoulder, a slow smile forming on her lips. "We've lived a quiet miracle, haven't we?" He nodded. "One that never needed a crowd." As the stars appeared one by one, the two of them sat in silence, Not because they had nothing to say, but because everything had been said. Their lives had spoken it, not in shouts, but in steadiness, in obedience, in quiet faith that held through every storm. And in the end, Lapidoth knew. His story had never been about being seen. It had been about seeing what mattered and holding it with unwavering love. And that, too, was part of God's design.